Warami Walamavami, which means welcome wherever you come from in the Sydney Aboriginal language. Welcome to our event today about a world of oysters and about how we can protect oysters for the future. The event is organized by the Marine Studies Institute, MSI, at the University of Sydney, the Sydney Environment Institute, and also the Association of Spanish Researchers in Australia Pacific. Before going any further, I would like to introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Mitch Gibbs, who is a Dangati man through kinship from Kempsey near Port Macquarie, New South Wales, and he has also recently completed his PhD in oysters biology at the University of Sydney. Mitch, would you be so kind to do the acknowledgement of country?
Yeah, no worries at all. So I'd like to pay respect to the Gadigal land, which is what I'm on, but any lands that everyone else around here are on, and always, and in paying respect in the land that we're on and the people that are from that land, I think that it's best to look at Mother Earth and always think about what she's being able to give us, which goes to do with being everyone here's on a laptop, that all of the materials that are in front of us are from Mother Earth, and just always remember and pay respect towards that everything that we get, everything that we have is because of Mother Earth. So if we can just take a couple of seconds just to really just try to just imagine that your feet are becoming roots and burrowing further into the ground until you actually reach, whether you're up on the top story of a building or standing on Mother Earth now. Just take a second just to really think about where we are and what we've got because of the place we're on and Mother Earth herself. So just take a second, just close your eyes if you want to, and just think about that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Mitch. That was excellent. Okay, so let's move along with our event today. So the structure of the event today is a panel. We have 4 amazing panelists, and we're doing it in Zoom. We had lots of ideas about how to do it with a lot more experts in a face-to-face event, for which we even had a grant to provide the oyster tasting in real life, and that would have been amazing, but maybe next year. So feel free to send us your feedback if you would like to have this face-to-face next year. Okay, so the structure is I'm going to have 3 questions for the 4 panelists, and I will ask them, and then they will give their answers. And after that, we will have a Q&A with the audience. So feel free to write down your questions, keep them to yourselves, or popping them on the chat, just write them there and we'll go through them in the end. So first of all, I want to introduce our wonderful panelists. So you have already met Mitch. Another panelist is Dr. Anna Bucknott, who is a senior researcher at the University of Sydney, and she's also the project manager for the Sydney Harbour Research Programme at the Sydney Institute of Marine Science. Anna is also an oyster researcher, and she's interested in the restoration of oyster reefs. Then we also have Rubén López Mesa, who is a Spanish chef living in Orange, in New South Wales. And he is also one of the founders of Eat Spanish, the first Spanish non-profit gastronomic association in Australia. And our next panelist is Ewan McAsh, who is a marine scientist and oyster farmer who has expanded his family farm to include a nationally recognized marketing brand and a global software company. He's the founder of Signature Oysters, Smart Oysters, and also Oyster Life Share Farm. And also, this is followed by the first ever, I believe, I think we have invented this, BYO virtual oyster tasting. So after the formal questions finish, my colleague Anna Rubio with Rubén and Ewan will take you through a virtual oyster tasting. Okay, so let's start with the questions. So the first question is the same for everyone, and I would like Mitch to answer first. So why are oysters important to you?
Well, I guess as an Indigenous perspective, oysters are obviously very important. And I think that if anyone has ever heard about middens or have seen middens themselves or anything like that, would understand the importance that oysters have played for thousands of years, and how they still play an important role within coastal communities. Like whether that be for the food source or for the tools that the oyster shells make, or even the trading that happens with oysters. I think that there's a huge area in which that shows the importance of oysters within Indigenous culture, but I guess I'm limited on time, but yeah.
Thank you, Mitch. And another same question for Anna Booknot. So why are oysters important to you, Anna?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I think oysters are important for an environmental perspective. Oysters have this amazing capacity of forming reefs, and much as coral reefs in the tropics, generations and generations of oysters growing on top of each other can create immense, huge reefs, also the ones I have in the picture there, and Anna as well has in the back. And these can be hectare big, they can be enormous, and they used to be very common in the coast of New South Wales, really in estuaries in the east coast of Australia. And unfortunately, we have lost over 90% of these reefs. Since European colonization, there has been a series of harvesting of these reefs for lime, for construction, water quality issues, disease, invasive species, a whole cocktail of pressures that have meant that we lost most of them. But they used to be huge, and they used to be very common in these environments, and therefore they play a huge role in estuarine environments around Australia. They feed by filtering water, and in doing that, they remove a lot of contaminants and particles from the water column. So they're basically the kidneys of estuaries. They also host a huge amount of biodiversity, being fish, and therefore has important consequences for fisheries if we don't have them. But they also host a lot of animals in between the reefs, things like clams and worms and crabs, etc., that lives amongst them. So they're really important for biodiversity as well, and also have a lot of play important roles in things like coastal protection and the remediation of contaminants, which is is very important in areas that are highly urbanized and occupied by humans.
Thank you for that. And the next answer is from Ewan. So why are oysters important to you, Ewan?
For me, it's about livelihood. I grew up down here on the south coast of New South Wales, and I've got like surfboards in the background of my office. So for me, it was really, I got into oysters because I wanted to have that livelihood and to live on the water and be working out there. And that was when I was younger, about 10 years ago. But what's amazing about oysters is that they are so sustainable, and they are really an economic reason to protect the environment. Oysters need great water quality, and so if we have a thriving oyster farming or oyster farming industry, that's a reason to protect the environment, to not develop the catchment. And so in turn, by oyster farming, I'm actually protecting the lives and my lifestyle and my livelihood down here in the South Coast. What I love about where I live, I actually can have a beneficial contribution to because of oysters. So, and that sort of came to me later in my career. I realized that. I mean, as an oyster farmer as well, I had one of those moments a few years ago now where I was spraying poison on the grass. I've got small children to kill off weeds, bindies, the little thorns that get in your feet. And I remember feeling really uncomfortable doing it. I was like, but here I am. I thought, why am I uncomfortable spraying poison on weeds? And I realized, because I'm farming every day. We have forklifts, we have grading machines, we're a commercial operation. But when I thought about it, I was really amazed to realize, well, in my job, we don't handle chemicals. We don't have that sort of farming that's not that kind of farming that we do. So even after I've been farming for many years, I'm amazed at how sustainable oyster farming is. And that's why they're important to me.
Excellent. And our final panelist answering the question is Ruben. Why are oysters important to you, Ruben, as a chef?
Well, oysters for me, they are super important. First, because in one bite, you can tell many, many stories. I think Australia is very lucky. actually, because especially rock oysters is one of those things that everyone around the world should travel to Australia for. The complexity of it, the amount of stories that all the farmers can tell you about it, they're amazing. So yeah, I think we should be very, very proud. Someone the other day in an interview in Spain was asking me, so what do you think that is, the Australian national dish? And I guess that many people will, answer differently. I definitely say oysters, but just not oysters, oysters with finger limes. That for me is the unique experience that you can have in Australia.
That is indeed a very good experience. Okay, so we're moving on to question 2, and question 2 is a bit more targeted to each one of our panelists. So I would like to ask first to Anna Bucknut. Can you tell us why oyster restoration is needed? Why do we need it?
Well, oysters, as I said before, are important have been traditionally important in estuarine environments. And particularly in Australia, if you look at the main cities, Sydney, Perth, Melbourne, in Brisbane, they're built around estuaries. Estuaries are the focus of a lot of human activities, even in non-urbanized areas. There's a lot of recreational boating happening. There's a lot of fisheries, recreational fisheries, and commercial fisheries as well in these areas. So for that reason, estuaries are particularly impacted systems in our coastline. So oysters have this great capacity to fix some of the problems that we have introduced in these environments. They, as I said before, they're great to host biodiversity. They're used by fish for habitat and for food, and therefore have the capacity to help a bit recover some of the biodiversity that can potentially be impacted by human activities, and that for sure was impacted by the loss of oyster reefs. But also has this capacity of processing contaminants and cleaning the water. And that is something that is very relevant when we have a lot of activity on the catchment, a lot of modification of the land by rural use, etc. That does affect and modify estuaries. Oysters have the capacity to kind of ameliorate a bit of those impacts that we have in these estuarine environments. So recovering them can really play a role and try to manage all the inputs and all the stressors that we're putting in these ecosystems.
Okay, so now the next question goes to Ewan, and the question is, how do oysters grow, and what are the most important controls for farming oysters? Thanks,
Anna. So oysters grow, they're filter feeders, so they grow naturally in estuaries and bays in quite large numbers. So in commercial quantities, that's why traditionally we'd see lots of oyster reefs, which is just oysters upon oysters growing on each other. But we often get oysters in Australia. We can get wild caught oysters that we actually catch out of the river when they naturally settle. Then we'll once they grow to a certain size, we'll split them off slats. We would grow them in oyster baskets, and yeah, it's a day in the life of the oyster farmer could be summed up in terms of like managing these oysters. But probably best to describe my farm. So we have my farm's not large. We've got 5 employees. We have nearly 40,000 oyster baskets that are strung on lines. They're out there across maybe 5 or 6, 10 different, 5 hectares, maybe 200 different locations. And we'll handle, so there's about 40,000 baskets out there. We'll handle 600 to 1,000 baskets a day in and out of the shed. And what we were doing is basically putting so many oysters in those baskets, they grow, then we split them into more baskets, or we're harvesting to sell them. Sydney rock oysters take nearly 3 years to grow. Pacific oysters in this part where it's sort of warmer waters of New South Wales grow a lot quicker. So generally with oysters, it's all about handling. A good oyster farmer knows where their oysters are, what they are, when they need to go back and either split them, air dry them to kill off the marine fouling, and obviously to harvest and sell them. The most important controls for oyster farmers, for aquaculture or for oyster farming, is water quality. So Australia has amazing oysters, whether they're Sydney rocks or Pacific oysters. And one of the reasons we have amazing oysters is because we've got very, very good water quality. you know, it's the oysters are, you know, they are what they eat. They're out there in the water every day, and of course, being a filter feeding animal, what they filter eventually is what we will eat when we take. That's what we taste when we eat them. So, yeah, water quality is a big thing. And as I said, they're quite simple animals in terms of quality and controls. It's really about managing them as an animal, keeping them clean of fouling like barnacles and seaweed, etc. And we sort of bring them through to market so they've got a nice clean shell and deep meat cut. And that comes from the handling of the farmer, and yeah, the flavour and the quality and all that other good stuff really comes from water quality.
Okay, and so the next question is for Mitch. The First Nations are people, they have harvested oysters sustainably for thousands of years. What can we learn from Indigenous knowledge systems? What can we learn that we can apply to?
So I think something that should be understood is the, I guess, scope of what oysters are within culture to start with, because like we all know stories, or we've all may have heard stories about, I don't know, Tiddalik the frog, or some sort of creation story, a dreaming story about how like rivers were made, or birds became flightless, whatever it might be. Whereas it's those same stories that have been lesser told. So there's stories around oysters and how they've formed and why they're formed in that way, and the geographical locations for those oysters. So within particular areas around Australia, obviously all along the eastern seaboard of New South Wales especially, we have so many estuaries and so many communities that have really focused on oysters, and like there's middens that show that they're 98% full of oyster, especially Sydney rock oysters. And so understanding the cultural side of oysters would benefit the science side of oysters as well. And I think that looking at the cultural practices and how that's evolved, and between just pulling off rocks out of the water and cooking them from that, to then creating the string lines or rope, however, being made from barks of trees, but making these lines that the oysters are then able to attach onto. And so I think the main important thing that we can get from Indigenous practices is the concept behind it, the concept of being environmentally friendly throughout the whole transition of making the oyster, or harvesting the oysters, cultivating the oysters, all the way through from step A to right to the end, is all about the environmental sustainability and making sure that we have biodiversity and genetic diversity throughout all of the cultures. And I think that incorporating that more so within a lot of the practices of fisheries in general, but oyster practices can help along in that way. So yeah.
Very good. I have to thank our panelists for keeping to the time really, really nicely. Okay, so the next question is for Ruben. And do you feel that chefs should know more about the oysters they serve? Do you think it's a responsibility of the chefs to pass that knowledge onto the customers? What did you think, Ruben?
Yeah, absolutely. Not just chefs. I believe that it should be amazing to everyone. Stop getting the tradition unsucked oyster in a package, very dry, into I'm going to try to learn more about where it comes from, the story behind, and then I'm going to learn how to suck it properly and safely, and I'm going to enjoy it. For me, that is the message. I'm happy to start a campaign right now here with all of you. And why is important? Because what I said before, especially because of the quality. I believe that especially rock oysters, and in the coast of New South Wales, they are one of these world amazing snacks that we also know. People, probably a lot of people that they are really into oysters will know this, but others probably they don't know that rock oysters, for example, they just grow in New South Wales, a little bit in Queensland, and I think in Albany, in WA. That is incredible. That is like if I ask you to go to the north of Spain to try this delicacy that is called percebes, like gooseneck barnacles. You know what I mean? We should be so proud about this. So yeah, it is our responsibility. It is our responsibility to start conversations like today, more conversations with our farmers. And I think we have a long way to go, but we can do it.
Okay, I really, really agree with that. Okay, so we're going now to the third question for our panel. And the question is about how do you see the future of oysters in view of climate change, pollution, changing how we eat. I read the other day in an article that perhaps in decades we will look back and think we were crazy, we're eating animal meat, you know? So I want to throw the question to the panel. So I'm going to start with you. How sustainable do you see oysters growing into the future?
Yeah, I mean, can we increase the production of oysters? Absolutely. So, and again, many of the listeners might not know that Australia is like an export, like we're an exporter of oyster growing technology. Our basket systems, our grading systems, our software systems, which I'm a founder of a farm management system, Smart Oysters. We're exporting that to the world. So we are very good at growing oysters. The only thing that sets back oyster growing is water quality. But I believe actually even in New South Wales, the water quality has actually been improving as we get better and better at managing, pollution sources such as runoff from agriculture or townships. So, I mean, the amazing thing about oysters is that it's one of the few industries that we can scale up, we can grow, we can produce more of them in our estuaries, and it's only a good thing. Not only does it produce an amazing food source, it creates jobs in regional areas, jobs that people want to be part of. It also, it makes up in the farming infrastructure that we use for oyster farming makes up in some part for the loss of habitat like mangroves that we've lost and oyster reefs, so that there is evidence to show that the fish and the biodiversity around oyster farms is much higher than if they weren't there. There's just so many benefits to scaling up oyster farming that I can't see it not happening, and especially when it's paired with other ocean farming, regenerative ocean farming practices like seaweed farming, mussels, clams, all those products, which I think as Bren Smith from Greenwave succinctly puts it, like aquaculture species that don't swim away. He says, if we ask the ocean what we should grow, it's things that don't swim away. So yeah, and I think oysters are one of those. So yeah, the answer there is that I think, yeah, it's got a huge potential for sustainable growth.
Okay, thank you, Ewan. The next question goes to Ruben. And Ruben, do you think that in decades in the future, will you still be serving oysters in your restaurants, or will you be totally vegan or vegetarian based, or maybe eating insects? Who knows?
Look, I love everything. So yeah, we see. No, I love meat protein. I love coming from Spain. Obviously, I love seafood and fish. I'm a massive believer that oyster market is gonna increase quite a lot. I see more the Australian market going into like a little bit like the Americans do, that the oyster type of open bar in front of you is more casual, more common. Here at the end of the day, sadly, or either you go to a really good restaurant or you do it at home, but there's nothing, there is not that vibe that we have in Europe, in America. So yeah, the answer is yeah, I definitely will be serving oysters. I'm serving oysters at this moment. So yeah.
That's good to know. So the next question is for Anna Bucknott. So will oyster restoration still be seen as the answer in the future? Or do you think it's something that we're going to do now and we're going to do it so well that we'll not need it in the future? Which other restorations will come afterwards?
Yeah, so I think, to restore oysters to even a close of extent they used to happen, it will take some time. So I think we'll see oyster restoration happening for a while. It really depends on a lot of people's support and society. Somebody put in the chat about what they can do. Just support these practices. There's a lot of negative, and people are scared of a lot of these changes in their shoreline when it's right at their doorstep, and supporting and communicating that to your local government for us is really the best way, best way you can collaborate. But oysters, estuaries are highly interconnected habitat. Everything that happens in one part of the estuary affects a different part. They're all a connected environment. And I think that multiple restoration, oyster reefs in the future will just be a part of a series of restoration projects happening all together. So at the moment we have oyster restoration, we have seagrass restoration and mangrove restoration. They're all kind of different things, but there's a lot of evidence that oysters provide a lot of benefits, for example, for seagrass and for mangroves. They actually are kind of at the foreshore. If you see the picture in the background, and as well, you can see the oysters in front of the mangroves. They really protect the mangroves from erosion. So there's a lot of possibilities, and I think that that is where we will go in about thinking about the environment as a whole and not just individual habitats.
And now, lastly, for Mitch, do you think we will learn from traditional practice?
Yeah, so in especially in relation to climate change and environmental factors like that, especially with heat, like I don't know if it's well known, but it's known that like long ago there were dugongs in Sydney Harbour due to the sea temperature rise, and Aboriginal people within Sydney Harbour at least had still production of oysters due even when those temperatures had risen. And I think that understanding the cultural perspectives around oysters and understanding those stories that specifically were handed down over time, because that gives us a background as to what was needed in that environment at that time. It also gives us an understanding of the interconnectedness, as Anna was saying, that we don't necessarily know in a lot of Western sciences. And I think that if we're able to understand a lot of that cultural aspect of oysters and the stories that go around that, and even the songs that go around that, they all represent and they all show different knowledge, whether it be geographical locations that had specific oyster reefs, or whether it be because of interactions between certain grasses and oysters, or fish and oysters, or whatever it might be. And so, and especially being at those times beforehand when it was hotter, I think if we're able to understand those and understand how something might change physically within the oyster, we can then also understand that, well, if that's changed then and it also caused a decimation in the oysters, how can we try to rectify that? How can we not have that happen? And so trying to understand the physical cues that are given within these stories about populations either growing or populations declining, then we can also then incorporate that into our understanding of oysters now, and how, if we do understand that, how we can then see and try to rectify those inhibitions of the environment, or promote it as we could. Like, as Ewan saying, we could have a terrible amount of oysters if we wanted to, but I think that there's obviously always going to be that interconnectedness, and you've got to make sure you have a balance as well. And I think that all through Indigenous culture, it is keeping that balance. And I think that if we understand that more, then we'll understand the environment a lot better, so that we can propagate the right amount and make sure that we're having a healthy environment for oysters, as well as for every other fish and aquaculture that are there. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mitch. So if I have the summary correctly, we need to learn from First Nations practices to properly take care of what we're restoring and what we're growing in aquaculture, so we can then have healthy estuaries and healthy coastlines and really healthy oysters in restaurants. So did I get it right? Okay, good. So this was the last question that I had for the panel, and I would like to open it now to the questions from the audience. There are a few in the chat, but in the meanwhile, if you want to either put your hand up or use the reactions for your hand up, and I think someone will pick you and the question, because I cannot see everyone right now. Okay, so there is one question here for all panelists. If I were to focus on one thing, what can we do in life to support oysters in nature and in cultivation? Who wants to take this one? Ewan, you can take it.
Eat more of them. So if, which I know most people here are here because they're oyster lovers, but yeah, eat more of them and drive the commercial growth of them and support them. Visit oyster areas, and buy them. So I think that's from my perspective is like, that's the best way to support the industry. A thriving oyster industry, I think, can only bring good to the environment and to the economy. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I'd back him up there just by saying that the more people are worried about oysters, the more, especially on my side and probably Anna's side as well, that the more research will also go into them. And the more research we do understand about them, the better we are at making sure that these, and they are very, very important to the estuaries and to the economy. And they're, for, I guess, in a long way, they're very important all throughout our lives, whether we understand it or not. And I think that understanding that if more people are eating them and buying them, then there'll be more research done into them. So, yeah.
I'm actually totally agree with you guys, especially with information. For me, information is super important. I think there's lack of knowledge about oysters. I'm in contact with face-to-face with customers, and sometimes I see that there's a little bit of fear about oysters. And this is the time to talk about it and start saying, it's fine. Oysters are good for you. You definitely will know when an oyster is not good, because basically your nose is going to tell you. And that's it. Just try to talk about it, talk to your cousins, to your family and neighbors, and let's eat more oysters.
Thank you. Okay, so we have one hand up. I will keep on reading the ones from the chat afterwards, but Elspeth, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Thank you all. This is fantastic. Yeah, there's so much going through my mind. I mean, one of the things that, having done a fair bit of research on oysters from a kind of cultural side, is that I would say that, the people are divided into they either love oysters or they hate them. I mean, it's like this ludicrous sort of, when I do readings about writing, and people be just like, sea snot. So one of the little questions would be, how do we get people to eat more? I mean, I'd suggest like, in the Pacific Northwest in British Columbia, I had fried oysters with bacon in a roll. Oh my God, the most squeamish person would go for that. But my other question is more kind of for the scientists as well. So we know that oysters as keystone species can remediate and restore, as Anna said. And as Ewan said, we do have wonderfully pristine waters. But you also did say, Ewan, you were putting something on your bindies, and you knew that could probably go into where your oysters were. So how do we do this balance between restoring the water quality through oysters, so then that we can eat more, and a kind of campaign of education to people and to governments, perhaps, about that.
Anyone from the panel? Yeah, Ewan, go for it.
Yeah, it's just talking from personal experience. Really, the goal is to try and grow more oysters more efficiently, so we can have them, so we can provide them more cost effectively to people, and also building up local markets for oysters. So we really, always at Oyster Life anyway, we're really focused on trying to build up that, making oysters really easy to access from the farm in a local area, because I think that builds awareness. And as Ruben says, the best to get about oysters, that you open yourself. They are amazing. They taste beautiful, and it's not hard to open oysters. I have an online marketing company, Signature Oysters. So we saw last year when people were in lockdown and excited about buying stuff, all different things in, a huge demand for unopened oysters, and people, loving learning that practice. Like it's just a skill. Anyone can do it. If you can, if you can make a coffee, you can open an oyster. So yeah, I think really it's just about that, like making oysters more abundantly available, which is my job. And Anna's job is like trying to keep the water, help keep the waters cleaner, like restoring those sort of habitat. And Ruben, just get them on the menu. So it's
and as well, I would like to point it out that especially we need to change a little bit of the culture about it. Like we don't need to buy 12 oysters and eat 12 oysters at once. Like for me as a person who loves tapas and snacks, obviously, I love to buy oysters, put it in the fridge, and open a glass of wine or whatever, crack a couple of them, and enjoy like that. They last forever, and they are super healthy.
And I also say on the eating aspect, I know some people mightn't like to eat them raw, but a lot of traditional methods isn't eating them raw. And like if you're having trouble opening them, just put them on the barbecue the way they are. Once they're cooked, they'll open up anyway. You don't even have to. No blood spared.
Thank you.
I was in Brazil, in the Amazonian coast of Brazil a couple of years ago, and they told me that their traditional way of opening the oysters was exactly that, putting them on the barbecue for just a minute. And then when they start to open, they take them out. So no blood, as you said.
Actually, the liquid, once that it gets warm, it changes completely the profile of the oyster.
I might keep a couple of the ones that I ordered for today to open in the barbecue to compare. But as someone, I did not display my connection to oysters. So I'm a geomorphologist, but I also collaborate with the oyster restoration efforts. And I also grew up in northwestern Spain, and I was eating oysters before I could walk. So I love oysters. So anyway, there is another question to the panel here. If natural reefs intertidal are to be restored, will all the public have free access? And if so, won't the oysters be over-harvested?
So there's a few things happening there. The location of the oyster reefs will definitely depend. They are probably some of the places where oyster restorations are being planned intertidally would be accessible. But at the same time that this is happening, there is a push to list oysters as a threatened species. And if that happened, then the harvesting will be a lot more regulated than it is now. But it is a good question. And I guess it depends on location of those oyster reefs.
And I can also say, like, we've got really good fisheries management in Australia and New South Wales. So it is, illegal to harvest oysters, in certain areas. And we've got fisheries officers out there just, policing that kind of stuff, just like they police catch quotas, etc. So I think we can be confident that we can build up oyster reefs and have oyster farms, and there'll still be public access to oysters, but we won't overfish them. No.
Okay. And then the next question is also a bit more about the science. So would Sydney rock oysters be more resistant or thermal tolerant than Pacific oysters? Mitch, I think that has to do with your PhD, yeah?
Yeah. They've evolved in different ways. So Sydney rock oysters have evolved to being able to be at a higher level of strata within the intertidal zone. And so they're able to withstand less amount of water throughout the day, which is why Pacific oysters are then kind of pushed them up because of that. But Pacific oysters, they have evolved in a way that has allowed them to, I guess, withstand temperature change. So the temperature tolerance for Pacific oysters is a lot bigger, whereas the scope in which Sydney rock oysters can be on the strata level within the intertidal zones is a lot bigger. So they're kind of adapting differently so they both can survive.
There is another question about the impacts of climate change. So there is a big, it's quite a long question. I'm not going to read it all, but it's someone that loves oysters and has tried them in many places of the world. And so the question is, what kind of impact will climate change make on biodiversity of oysters? Will coastal engineering solutions help to solve the potential? the potential risks. Thanks a ton. Who wants to take this one?
What I will say about oysters, I'd be interested to hear Mitch's comments as well. What is amazing about Sydney Rock oysters is that in estuarine environments is that they experience a huge temperature range both in and out of the water. So in the Clyde River, on a tidal change, across mudflats, they might experience water temperature as high as 30 degrees as the water flows in over the mudflats and expose them, and then and then all the way down to maybe 16 degrees as that ocean water comes in. So that estuarine environment where oysters live is extremely variable. They've adapted to a high, all that variability in temperature and water quality. So I hope that makes them very resilient to climate change and a changing environment.
Well then, yeah, there's been studies that have shown that oysters, especially Sydney rocks in the muds, have even shot up to 60 degrees as a heat shock, which has shown that. And so I think that there is definitely. But I think that what happens, and I don't know, in fact, Pauline's put her hand up, she could probably tell you more than I can. But I think inside the oysters is cooler, and because they've kept that water within them, they've been able to stay cooler for longer. But yeah.
Pauline, is your question related to this? Did you want to jump in?
Well, I kind of wanted to say that my group has been working on this very question for the last 15 years. So we probably do have Elliot's on the line, I can see as well. So he might also want to say something. But basically, Ewan, you're right. In some ways, they've lived in this variable environment. But I think we now need to ask whether they're at the limits of what they can do. And we did publish a paper this year on exactly this topic. Are those oysters high up in the intertidal zone who've experienced elevated temperatures and decreased pH? Are they, how much scope do they have compared to oysters that are subtidal and have experienced a more stable environment? And we found that oysters which are in the upper intertidal are pretty much at the edge of their limits and their resilience. And those those species which are in the subtidal are kind of got a bit more capacity. So the habitat where they're in seems to predict their future capacity to be resilient. And so the more kind of, I suppose, the hotter for those particular, those oysters that are in those sort of more extreme events, they may not have as much capacity as those ones that have had an easier life. So when we have a stressful life, if we were all oysters and we've had a stressful life, which we have over the last 2 years in COVID, maybe we're also at our limits of capacity. But if you have a kind of a more stable life, maybe you've got a little bit more to give. But these questions about, transgenerational plasticity, how much more plasticity do I have as an oyster, is the thing that really is going to determine their future state. I'm going to hand over to Elliot because he might talk about his work where he pressured these oysters to 50 degrees. And although they might taste good cooked when you cook them at 50 degrees, we couldn't quite kill them. So over to Elliot. And maybe Elliot, you might want to comment on the Pacific oyster one as well, because Pacific oysters, they're a lot more tougher than you might think.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. And I guess building on what you said and what Ewan mentioned about oysters living in a quite a variable environment, the way I see it is it's almost like the death from a thousand cuts, in that, they're living in this tolerant environment and they're doing okay. But when we start adding those extra pressures, when we're thinking about climate change, acidification, whether it be pollution in their environment, these things can actually add up and have a negative effect on oysters. And also, Ewan, in your own farming context, while the oysters might be alive, if they're not growing and then they're not putting on the weight and the size that you need, suddenly your operation may become less viable. And these things, so just because oysters are alive and they're there doesn't mean that they're necessarily doing well. And going forward in a climate change context, this is going to be quite important as well. So, and yeah, I guess on the Pacific oysters, although traditionally they're from a cooler environment, they seem to survive some water temperatures better than Sydney rock oysters. So it's certainly an interesting dynamic, but also, like Mitch touched on, they are generally better at surviving in the air than Pacific oysters are. And you would know that from your own farming practices. Pacific oysters are far less tolerant of being out of the water compared to Sydney rock oysters. And that's why you get some stratification in the shoreline as well. So again, moving forward with climate change, that's something that is going to be important. But just one last point that Pauline touched on, not only between species, we see massive variability within Sydney rock oysters. So when we expose different genotypes of oysters to climate change, we find that some are far better at coping with it than others. And in that heatwave experiment where we had 50-degree treatments, some families of oysters experienced actually no significant death, whereas others were almost completely wiped out. So that does show that within the Sydney rock oyster themselves, there is this capacity to tolerate different environments, and certainly something to look forward to in the future. So yeah, thanks.
Some of those family line results that we're just looking at the moment are really interesting, because when we subject the oysters, in particular family lines, to temperature and low pH, we find that some family lines can really cope with that. You know, they seem to be able to cope quite well, but other family lines, they suffer significantly. And I suppose the question that I have now is whether this resistance or resilience can be built on, and what that means for the future of the Sydney rock oyster industry. You know, how much can we build resilience? Just like in people, this is an oyster. If we were all oysters, how much can we build our own resilience over time? And some of that's going to depend on our genetics.
Well, this was amazing. We had some of the people that we were going to have in a panel if we had longer, like the face-to-face with a larger panel. So this is luxury. So fantastic. Thank you so much, Elliot and Pauline, for contributing. We're going to move to some other questions. There were some questions in that some of the people in the audience sent before. And so there is one question that I thought is interesting. That is like, what should we as consumers look for when buying oysters to make the most sustainable pick? Is it some sort of farming practice and certification? How do we choose a good sustainable oyster?
I would personally say that I would like to see like a certification of a stamp, where I can see the oyster, tell where everything is come from, when it has been harvested, and what I'm eating, basically. In Spain, it's very popular to have DPOs, which is this denomination of origins, and I'd like to see that in Australia.
So I would say that generally most all oyster farms are quite sustainable, and then it's really about where you buy them from, you know, and how you're consuming them. So obviously, if you get them direct from the farmer gets better premium, not that, and learn how to open them. But yeah, most oyster farming is quite sustainable and only improving. You know, it's one of those industries that I think oyster farmers understand that, you know, they themselves contribute, you know, but they're relying on the water quality, so they need to have sustainable practice. So I think you know, when it comes to in terms of farming practice, oysters are very low impact, no matter how you're growing them. Definitely in Australia.
Yeah. And there is another question here that is, it relates to that one. There are two questions regarding the commercial feature. So there is one, is there a commercial feature for the flat or Angassi oyster? And then the other question that is somehow related is like, if the oysters are in dirty, polluted water, do they take that on and thereby become polluted, or do they just filter it out? So who wants to take these questions?
Yeah, for sure. So there's different types of pollution, and I think that needs to be clear here. So there is pollutant from things like pesticides and biofouling paint from ships, and maybe even industrial and heavy metals. Those can bioaccumulate on oysters, and therefore, and I'm sure Ewan can really talk to this. There are procedures for detecting that on farm. So that's why you should buy it from a farm and not go from the wildlife, because you never know what it has inside. But there's other types of pollution, which is what we call organic or nutrient pollution, which is when you have a flush of nutrients into the environment. That happens when you have things like runoff from agricultural land in terms of fertilizers, and they can also happen even when you get some sewage. Sewage can come with a lot of things, but mainly nutrients. And when you get that, actually oysters grow better. And that is not a contaminant that will really affect you once it's processed by the oyster, although sewage can come with E. coli and bacteria and pathogens, and that's a whole other story as well. But in terms of the pollutants that they can accumulate, the recommendation is do not eat oysters that you don't know what they have. Just go to a farmer.
Yeah, I'll just add that, because we've got two different, we've got sort of edible oysters and restoration oysters. Oysters have an incredible ability to filter out particles out of the water, which is why they're so great for restoring poor waterways. But that's not where we're growing them to eat. Where oysters are getting grown to eat, they're in clean waterways, and we have very strict management plans. So, to ensure that there's no heavy metals in the oysters. We only harvest, we don't harvest during periods of rainfall, etc. So Australia being, we're very good at doing that. We have great management practice, great food safety practices for oysters. So our oysters are, not only is their water clean, but our oysters are very safe. But we also recognise that oysters have this amazing ability to clean up Sydney Harbour or those actually degraded estuaries, and that's what they're doing, with the Billion Oyster Project in New York, etc. So just two different things. There's oysters you're going to eat, and there's this amazing ability for oysters to restore the environment.
So flat oysters have disappeared, along many of the places they used to be, but we've done some experiments on those as too in terms of their resilience. And guess what? We found when we heat shocked the flat oysters and we put them into Lake Macquarie where it's warm, flat oysters did better than Sydney rocks. So this idea of resilience, I think, and the sustainability, which is so important for our shellfish of the future, is going to be a big area of investigation in the future, because flat oysters have a special thing. Do you know they brood their young, rather like with pouches? And Maria, you were part of that experiments that we did. I just saw you there on brooding young, because that gives them maybe a special resilience because they have low CO2 when they brood their young. So maybe they're better in the wild and will cope with climate change.
Yes, for just as a quick one, brooding oysters, because they grow up in a high C2 environment inside mum, they tend to be a bit more resilient. Same as the one in Chile is the same. So I know you want to move on, Anna.
Yeah, no, it's I would stay and actually keep on talking about this, but I think we have a virtual oyster tasting to go to. And I want to thank everyone, the audience, researchers that came in from the audience and contributed really well, and especially to all of our panelists. I'm going to introduce you now to Ana Rubio, who is a marine biologist. She's my colleague from the Spanish researchers in Australia Pacific, and she will be driving the oyster tasting. So thank you very much, everyone. I want to remind you that the Sydney Environment Institute, Marine Studies Institute, and the Spanish researchers in Australia Pacific, we all have many events coming, and I want to invite you to all of them, and feel free to send us feedback. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna. I think we are too many Annas in this panel. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ana Rubio. I'm a shellfish researcher as well. I've been biting my tongue to answer some of those questions that they were on, but there were enough researchers answering them. I actually have been working with the oyster industry in Australia now for probably 15, 17 years. In fact, I did my PhD in Ewan's farm. I think at the time I even have a toothbrush there of how much time I spent in that oyster farm. So yeah. So I know very well, what the industry do, and I've learned a lot from them. It was very important for me to be able to be there And equally, I've seen in the panel, I mean, in the people that they have registered to this event, that there is a number of oyster farmers from the South Coast and in other places. So thank you for joining us. And we will be asking later on to share your thoughts on oyster tasting. So what we are going to do here is to start with, Ewan has moved to an area where he's going to tell us what is the best way of actually shucking an oyster so we don't end in hospital. We've heard as well that the backup is you put them a bit under the grill and that kind of softens the adducted muscle. So, but let's learn from the expert and see and check what he's doing, that he's already doing some. Ewan, do you want, I can see your hands that they are busy. Do you want to unmute yourself and talk at the same time as you are shucking, or do you want me to describe that? You are better doing that.
Yeah. Good day, everybody. Yeah, so I've just moved. I don't know if you'll be able to see. You can see in the background there. I'm down on the Clyde River, just in one of our little oyster sheds, which is actually my office now. But yeah, I've got some oysters there. I was just shucking some oysters on camera. Oyster shucking is not hard. And obviously you get an amazing flavored oyster, fresh, taste the ocean, taste the river it came from. So that's what we want to do. That's what Ruben, is a big advocate for. I'm a big advocate for it. Yeah, I'll bring the camera down and I'll just walk you through and talk you through how to shuck an oyster. And as Mitch says, you don't even need to do it. You can still put them on a barbecue or steam them in your steamer. I think what a great message about to come out of this is that take them off a pedestal. Just do what you need to do. I put them in paellas. We've stirred them through, linguine. Just have a go. They don't have to be eaten just raw. But for now, again, I'll show you how to open one quite easily. So and I hope you can still hear me, but yep. What you can, what's different about oysters today is that they're farmed, the farming techniques have improved quite a lot. So oysters are, now got a really regular shape. They're nice and cupped, and they're not like the old they call them stick oysters that used to grow really gnarled in different shapes and sizes. And they're the ones that you often hear stories about, people stabbing themselves or, going to hospital on Christmas Day because they couldn't open their oysters. But now you can even see these oysters, they're not, they're all got their individual characteristics. They all are quite easy. They've got the hinge point here, and the fan is, that's where they open there. So to open oysters, we get an oyster knife with a nice sharp point.
But I can teach you, you're not listening. I am listening to you.
So we've got an oyster knife with a nice sharp point. Again, this is actually a really key aspect of opening oysters, because with a nice sharp point, you're less likely to slip. You're more likely to actually, crack the oyster. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the point of the oyster into the hinge and wriggle it in there until I feel like it's between the two shells. Then I'm going to twist to crack it. And then the abductor muscle is always up here on the right-hand side if the hinge is pointing towards you. And we're just going to slice that with the knife. So, and again, put them down on the ground. Usually I'd recommend a tea towel, but I haven't brought one with me. So you could wrap it in a tea towel, just protect your hand. And we're just going to put it down on the ground. And we're just going to push and wriggle until I feel, which I can now, that the oyster is between the two shells. See, it's stuck there. So now I just twist. There we go. And you've hopefully heard that crisp crack. And then I'm picking the oyster up. And I'm actually turning the oyster knife sideways. And I'm going to lever her up and then ultimately, cut the abductor muscle. And there we go. This is probably the best example of a Sydney rock oyster you'll get. Really nice dark black rim, plump, and moist. People often ask me, how do they know when oysters aren't good or are fresh? Well, oysters will stay alive if they start to dry out around the edges. If you have them at home, that generally means that they've been out of the water, they're starting to lose their water. It's time to eat them quite quick. If oysters are sealed up and have water in them, you can guarantee they're good. When they die or when they're sick, they'll actually gape. So,
and as well, Ian, the nose will tell you.
Yes, yeah. That's another good reason why with the Sydney Rock oysters, you don't need to put them in the fridge. You can keep them on your kitchen bench in a salad bowl, maybe with a damp cloth on them. And yeah, as Ruben says, eat 1 or 2, 3 every night with a glass of wine. One, you keep them in sight, so you're always looking at them, thinking about them, but they'll last all week like that. And then, as you say, if they do go off, it'll be at room temperature. The oysters will open, and you can smell them, you can throw them. And they do. They're animals, so we handle thousands of these oysters when we process and harvest. So the odd one will get damaged. The odd one won't. One might have come in sick or compromised. So you'll get the odd one, just like you get a punnet of strawberries. There's always a moldy one in there, right? So
I like to point it out that a lot of people. So there's different techniques to suck the oyster. What Ewan has just said is just put it through the bottom, through the hinge, but as well there's a technique to do it from the top. I got a question for you or for everyone. What's going on with the flipping of the oyster in Australia?
Yes,
What's
I was
that?
going to say. That's true, Ewan, because in Spain we don't flip them. And here, and not only that as well, now that we are asking that question, what about the time of the year where people like eating oysters? Very different in Spain, very different in the US, very different here in Australia. Do you want to make any comments about here, at least Ewan, but you've traveled around the world, so you can answer.
Yeah, sure. So flipping the oyster, honestly, I think it's just personal preference. I think flipping of the oyster is, what you don't want is to give someone an oyster necessarily, I guess. Well, you can, I don't know. But if you give someone an oyster and you haven't cut, which I didn't actually show you guys, cut the abductor muscle off the bottom of the shell, that's when you can sort of tip it back and the oyster slides into your mouth. If you don't cut that muscle, it won't go anywhere. You'll have to sort of dig it out of the shell. So I believe I will go, is that flipping the oyster is really about, as you cut that muscle, there's been a habit of flipping the oyster up and seeing a different side of the oyster. I'm actually with Ruben. I generally don't flip. I only flip if I make a mistake and cut the oyster with my knife, and then I'll flip it to hide it.
Yeah.
So I'm an Australian chef. I was trained here, okay? And what they told me when they told me how to suck the oyster, it was goal number 1 is keep as much liquid as you can, okay? So that's why flipping it, keeping the oyster stay straight, it was the key success for the customer later on to enjoy.
I got told.
Yep.
I got told. I was talking to a guy at a restaurant one time because we ordered some oysters and came out, and I asked the same thing because I was like the oysters I've eaten, I just broke them open and ate them. And then he said that a lot of people like to see how full the oyster is, and so they flip them to try and show how good in condition the oyster is in.
That's it. So if you watch Ewan now, can you flip that oyster so people know what we mean with flipping? So basically that oyster has been just shucked and the top.
Shucked?
Yeah.
It's shucked and then the abductor cut on the bottom. So now it's free from the shell. So that's unflipped, and this is flipped. It really doesn't matter.
I can tell you that's an Australian label because I've worked with many chefs from different parts of the world, and they were like, "Why do I need to do one more movement? I'm spending 16 hours sucking oysters." Yeah.
But I think it could be because you guys get pretty good value when the oysters are in condition. And in order to see that oyster in condition, you need to flip it, right? Or not?
Yeah. Yeah. It's again, it's just one of those things. Who knows where it comes from? It's just a cultural thing about flipping the oysters. I don't necessarily do it. Again, if I'm shucking oysters at, I used to have an oyster bar, or I do wedding events. I'm with Ruben. It's just another motion, and it doesn't add anything to the oyster.
For me, the sorry, Ian, for me, the important thing at that point is try to keep the oyster straight, because honestly, that liquid is gold. I can tell you, Shuck, the same oyster from the same farm, harvest the same day, one put the liquid out and have just the mollusk, and the second one with the liquid, and it will take you to another place.
One of the things, so the other thing, one of my pet, I'm going to go tricks and tips, but I'll start with a pet hate of being an oyster farmer, is the obsession with opening oysters fast, or just opening oysters fast. How fast can you open them? You know, I've got to go fast. It's like, it takes me 3 years to grow these oysters. You can take 3 minutes to open one oyster. I don't mind, you know, like it, and you'll enjoy it more, you know. So yeah, if you're buying your oysters unopened, it's okay to slow down. It's okay to struggle with the first few. Just take your time, and before you know it, you'll have the knack, you know. And it's, you know,
yeah, they are like pancakes.
So
I was going to say the first one is hard. Sorry. Yeah, you go.
So the other tip is, and tip and trick is that small oysters are easy to open. So
I was going to say that. I was going to say exactly that.
So everybody wants the big oysters, but if you buy smaller oysters, one, they're better value. You know, you get, you know, they're quite cost effective, and two, they're a lot easier to open, especially if you're learning.
And probably they are tastier as well.
That's debatable, but you know, they'll taste just as good. You know, like often we do have, and then a bigger oysters, a big Pacific oyster. Sorry, I don't have any here. I might get some if we have time. You know, again, steam them open, barbecue them. You know, take them off the pedestal. Just do what comes naturally. They don't need to be on ice on a white plate with clean wedges. You can just, you know, like I say, shuck them on a table in your hand by the fire pit, any way you like.
So I was going to, I mean, the whole idea was some of you have ordered oysters, and I would like you to encourage. I actually opened mine. Where are they? Look at them here. I did it before because exactly what Ewan said, it takes me a while. I was going to, we are going to keep talking about flavors and texture and shape, and, you know, like, but maybe just feel free to start eating them, drinking if you found, you know, or you've been organized to have your favorite beverage to go with it. And I would like to see in the chat, if you can, and if your hands are clean, where your oysters are from, like the ones that you're eating tonight, or if you don't have any oysters tonight, or this afternoon, where is the best oyster that you've had, you know, and which location. And in the meantime, I'm going to keep talking to Ruben and to Ewan about, yes, Ruben, what kind of questions do you get when you are in a restaurant? You know, you've worked in one of, you know, of very top kind of restaurant in Oyster Bar kind of type in Sydney. Were there any kind of specific questions you were getting from the customers?
Yeah, so I work in an oyster bar, New York style, open bar. We had every day around 12 different oysters around Australia, and it was a show. It was an absolutely show. Definitely the most popular one, they were Wapengo, they were Coffin Bay and St. Helens, that's for sure. And yeah, they were more interested about the farmers. I'm a massive believer of the story behind each product, okay? So for me, there's two different parts of the story there. One is learn an oyster farmer and learn about him and what his philosophy about what he does with the produce. That's one thing. And secondly is trying to learn how to eat it properly. For those that they are less adventurous, I do recommend to add like a vinaigrette, like a mignonette, something that is not a good a little bit of acid. But for those who they really would like to try an Australian experience, yeah, try to suck them at home, be careful, keep them straight, try the liquid, and try to think when you are eating your oyster, try to think about the minerals, try to think about the saltiness, try to think about the story that Ian was telling you about where he's located. Yeah.
So if it's possible, can you actually let Mel, what was the name? Mel Page. I would like the group that is with Mel Page. I would like to see if they can unmute themselves, and they have a lot of oysters from a lot of different places, and I would like to hear from them if possible. I don't know what they are eating and where. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everybody. So we've got oysters from Tweed, from Clyde River, from Narooma, so Wodonga, from Rubio and from Cambula, and we've all been tasting our way down the coast. It's been really interesting to try them. Some have been out of the water for a lot longer than others, and you know, just the interesting flavour change that you get from that. And I think you know, there's 6 of us here and everybody's palate's a little bit different. So we're all kind of choosing different oysters that we really like. I suppose the thing that I really wanted to point out, and I think we've talked around a little bit, is that seasonality of oysters. You know, a lot of people want to eat them when they're really plump and creamy, but, you know, they're really good to eat the whole year round. And I think that would be a great story if we can start to tell that in the oyster industry, that it's not just a summer to Easter kind of thing, that you can actually have them in winter and they have a real flavour depth to them there. So yeah, I think that's what, from our point of view, we'd really like to get across as well. What do you, Cardi, have you got anything more to add?
You covered it beautifully.
And it's Greg's 50th birthday today.
Oh,
so
happy birthday. So is there a winner in that table?
Oh,
Clyde was a close runner-up. They were Clyde were exceptional. Ewan, love your work.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you. And it was a
runner-up. I'm going a runner-up to Pambula.
So these are the typical conversations we always have between oyster farmers, you know, when I go and see them. It's always like which estuary and whatever. But Ewan, can you tell us a bit of, even within the same estuary, so even within the Clyde River, you will be able perfectly, well, or I don't know if perfectly, but to know where an oyster comes from, which lease and which part of the estuary. Is that true? Or can you?
Yeah. Well, I would say, so that's really so every estuary has a unique flavour. Absolutely. I think those guys are just talking about it. And you know, I could definitely pick a Clyde River, you know, in a blind test. And I probably can tell you if it's a South Coast oyster or a North Coast, because of the, you know, the flavour. The North Coast oysters tend to be more bold, and, you know, South Coast oysters more crisp and, you know, minerally. But within an estuary, it also comes down to salinity. So the further up you travel the river, the less salinity it is. So yeah, we can definitely tell that. Also, given that with salinity as well, with, you know, rainfall and an estuary environment, there's a lot of mixing going on. So, but you know, just every estuary has will have a unique flavour, and then depending on where in that estuary the farmers harvested it and what tide range, they'll have something extra in terms of salinity, as well.
Yeah, so it seems like temperature has something to do with that, like in terms of the, you know, like how firm and how, you know, the body texture and things like that. So a lot of people talk about the difference between eating an oyster from Tasmania straight from the water than from somewhere up north that is a bit warmer. So I was, going to ask about different types of oysters, and we talked about that before a bit. We have, especially here in New South Wales, we have access to Pacific oysters, flat oysters, and Sydney rocks. They are all being farmed in different places, in different quantities, and whatever. Is there, both of you? I want to hear from the chef and from the oyster farmer. I don't know. Is there flavor or preference or something interesting about them, apart from what we've heard so far in terms of the biology?
For me, definitely Sydney rock oysters has a level of complexity that you cannot find anywhere else, especially in the aftertaste. Yes, they are rich, creamy, they're sweet, but for me, it's the 2 minutes after you ate the first oyster, you know how your mouth is asking you for another. And that is incredible. I don't think that you find any other product that it does something like that. So yeah, the minerals is important. What are you pairing it with? So first for me, it would be, yeah, I love Angassi, I love Pacific, but for me, the winner is definitely the Sydney Rock Oyster from New South Wales. And I would definitely drink something Spanish with bubbles, for sure.
And I'm going to say that, you know, when I talk about oysters, so I've got the 3 oysters, and I do, people, you know, what's better, what's this and that. Well, it's like, you know, it's like comparing tuna and snapper, you know, like another high premium fish, you know, like they've got their different flavor profiles. What's amazing, like, so I grow both Pacific oysters, which I did go and get some just then, and the Sydney Rock oysters, which you can sort of, you know, see the size difference and color and shape of the shell. We grow them here in the river, and often they'll be grown side by side on the same lease. So they're feeding from the same water, but they have distinct flavors. The Sydney Rock oysters here have that complexity that Ruben talked about, that minerality, and the Pacific oysters, and you know, a characteristic by that super sweet after flavor. Like, they just are a really sweet oyster, and obviously large, you know, great for barbecuing, great for steaming. But and my understanding is this, and I'm happy to be corrected, maybe I even got it from you, Anna, that my understanding is, you know, and Sydney Rock oysters Pacific oysters grow almost twice as fast as the Sydney Rock oysters. My understanding is that they have a larger mouth, and they eat a broader range of food than the Sydney Rock. Sydney Rocks are very fussy. They've got a small mouth. They're just eating the smallest plankton and getting bits of material coming in the water. So even though they're grown side by side, they're eating a different food from the river, and they have a totally different flavor. So I think that's amazing. I like both oysters, and they serve both purposes. For us, our season for Sydney Rock oysters, so once the water gets really cold, right before spring starts, so from August through to November, the Clyde River, you know, it's not really our season for Sydney Rock oysters, but we have amazing Pacifics, and that's why we grow them, just to fill that production gap, make sure we got great quality oysters year round.
It's funny that you pointed out about the sweetness of the Pacific. In the restaurant, I found that beginners, so people that they are getting used to oysters, they always prefer Pacific just because they are sweeter. You know?
Yeah. And on the other spectrum of that is when we talk about flat oysters and gazi oysters. Well, they're your oyster lovers oyster. You know, they're really bold flavor. They're strong. You know, the Shiraz, you know, of the oyster world. So I love Angassi oysters. I have grown them in the past, and yeah, if you love oysters, then you love Angassis. But if you're just new to oysters, I'd steer clear. Yeah.
I found a little bit harder to suck them, actually. Angassi.
Oh.
Sorry?
I found harder to suck the Angassi.
Oh, yeah. So
they usually break.
Yeah, so Angassi grow subtidally. So, you know, they grow further down in the water column, like we heard about tonight. So they don't have that, their shell is generally not as hard, and, you know, they grow fast. But they just don't get the rough and tumble of the, you know, the fetch and the waves that the Sydney Rock oysters and the Pacifics do. So that's why they have a softer shell. To open Angassis, if you can get them, I know there's some coming out of Tasmania now. I actually use a paring knife, a really thin blade to come in through the front, into the front lip and get to that abductor muscle, and that way you can avoid breaking the shell. So yeah, but again, if you know, Sydney Rock oysters, they're a bit smaller, they're easy to open. The Pacific oysters, I love them to death, but they are difficult. Like, you'll break a knife opening these guys. So if you're new to oysters, if you're new to shucking, start with Sydney Rock, start small.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sorry,
Ruben. Yeah.
I don't know that if many people know that in the professional section we have an oyster stand. It's like a metallic stand that you can put the oyster. So it's much easier just to go for it and open hundreds and hundreds of oysters every night.
Yeah. I was going to say we are starting to run out of time, but before we go, I wanted to ask both of you about this theme or this. What do you do with an oyster when you put it in your mouth? Do you chew it or do you don't chew it, or do you, you know, what is the best way of taking the flavor out of an oyster?
Definitely, there's a lot of people that they are put off by the texture. Okay, so especially at the beginning. I think it's something that you just get used to. I would definitely go first for the liquid, enjoy that liquid that is gold, and later on, and chew it like you chew a piece of meat or any other stuff, because the oyster is gonna tell you where it comes from.
Ewan, do you want to add up? What is your experience?
You just chew them. Yeah, like I don't know where you get that'll get the most fun. It's savor them, you know, like they're again. Took me 3 years to grow oysters. You know, the farmers, you know, put a lot of time and attention to grow them for such a long period of time. Just slow down and enjoy them. You know, it's and you do it with friends, do it with drinks, and do it as often as you can.
There's a lot of things actually that you can do with that. In a restaurant, we ended doing like a type of like a mayo, but instead of using the egg yolk, we use the oyster.
Yeah.
So basically it combines and you get like a type of like a pil sauce in Basque that is absolutely delicious.
I think that we need to kind of have another oyster event because there's still so many questions we need to go through. I remember being in one of the oyster conferences that we have normally once a year, and I remember trying ice cream, oyster ice cream. It was amazing, and I've never thought about it. And they served it in this little bowl on a shell, and it was like, you know, the weirdest thing ever. But I think that there's a lot of new techniques going on now in the kitchen that, you know, that oysters are going to have all these different shapes and forms and whatever. So I wanted to thank, I mean, I'm going to pass on the voice to Ana Vila soon, but first of all, I wanted to thank everyone that has been joining this part of the event, and I hope that you learned a few things. It was short. We didn't want to keep you in front of the computer for much longer, but hopefully next year we can organize something face-to-face, and hopefully we can go and visit a farm, because it's nothing like being on a farm and seeing what the farmers do and how they grow oysters. And definitely to thank all those ones that they order oysters and they supported the industry, and those businesses like Signature Oysters, Broadway Oysters, you know, East 33, all of them, they've been providing oysters online to everyone that ordered them. So please keep doing that. Doesn't matter where the oyster farmers are, they will find a way of sending you oysters if you cannot go and see them because of COVID or the reason. So Ana Vila, do you want to close the event?
Okay, I will. I have to say thank you to everyone. It has been super interesting. It's just a shame that we couldn't do it face to face, but definitely I am completely pumped right now. I really want to do it next year with everyone face to face and have lots of oysters in the end to taste, and different ways to cook them and so on. So yes, thank you everyone, especially to our panelists, but also to our fantastic audience. It has been great. Thank you very much.